Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Patch 3.19's Balanced Manifesto came out today. This is the day where GGG outline all of the major changes that are being made to character power, but with a focus on the things that are nerfing character power. The things that are buffing it will tend to be revealed more in later days. So this is going to be pretty nerf heavy, but actually less than I was expecting going through it. It's been really funny looking at the Path of Exile subreddit, which is on fire at the moment with people saying, this is the end to defensive characters and things like that. Whereas I looked through this and was like, yeah, this is going to shake up the meta a bit. It's going to create a few new builds. It's going to kill off a couple of the things that we're all really sick of. And it's also not going to have all that much of an impact in overall character power. So let's go through the changes and firstly, a very high level overview. So firstly, spell suppression is being changed in the sense that the gear for spell suppression is being nerfed, whereas spell suppression on the tree is being buffed. This is likely going to make it so that spell suppression is more focused on right-hand side of the tree builds, and left-hand side of the tree builds will probably not usually invest in suppression. Instead, they're likely to want to invest in increasing their maximum resistances instead, because they've got more access to it. Currently, maximizing spell suppression is pretty easy no matter where you are on the tree, and people will go for maximum spell suppression and a bunch of maximum resistances. This is probably the biggest single nerf overall, but it's a nerf that's hitting the most defensively powerful ascendancies at the moment, like Inquisitor, so it's going to bring them down a little bit in power. I think, however, that you'll find most characters, wherever they are on the passive tree, will be able to build typical Raider defenses. Now, they can do that in a couple of different ways, either through spell suppression or through the use of a combination of a moderate life buffer and maximum resist raising. So I think ultimately those changes are going to be fairly substantial, but they're not going to be anything like the build destroyer that people are pretending they're going to be on Reddit. The next big change that's happening is that minions are being massively overhauled. Intention being twofold. Firstly, to decouple the Necromancer ascendancy and the minion playstyle somewhat. Necromancer will still be compelling for minions, but it will no longer be mandatory. And that's been because of that +2 to the level of all minion gems node being so good. That has been so substantial that non-Necromancer ascendancies haven't been very competitive. Some of that power is being transferred to gear, and then there's a whole bunch of other changes to minions. Ultimately, I think that the situation for minions is an entirely fresh meta, where there'll be new things that are better, new things that are worse, but we're going to have to figure out what those all are. The next major series of changes that are discussed are going to be to reservation clusters. Now, Reservation Masteries and Reservation Clusters on the passive tree, so I'm not talking about cluster jewels here, I'm talking about the core passive tree. Those clusters that provide reservation efficiency and aura effect, they're getting a little bit of a nerf, and it's a pretty substantial one because the masteries are getting nerfed there. Reservation Masteries, there's 2 of them that pretty much everyone takes. 15% mana reservation efficiency, that is outright being removed, and 15% increased effect of your auras on you, that's being nerfed to 10%. That said, even with all of these changes, I think defenses will be in a pretty solid place overall. I think it will be a little bit harder to get to the point that you are face tanking uber bosses, but I do think that for players that dodge the most telegraphed attacks, you won't find that you're dying all that much. That said, let's go through everything in a bit more detail. So firstly, defense balance. We already discussed how spell suppression is being changed so that it is no longer as central to gear and it is more about the passive tree. This is interesting in that this is quite a different change to a lot of the other changes that they're making. A lot of the other changes are about decreasing the amount of power that's available on the passive tree and increasing the amount that's available on gear. And you'll see that especially when we get to minions. So this is the complete opposite. Dexterity-based body armors and shields, their top tier spell suppression roll is being nerfed from 32 to 34% down to 20 to 22%. So a big deal there. That's a big change. Similar sorts of nerfs to spell suppression modifiers on dex helmets, boots, and gloves. These are now going to be nerfed from 22% at top to 14% at top tier. And so see here that you're not realistically going to get capped spell suppression just from rare items. Additionally, the Eater of Worlds implicit is getting nerfed by 2%, and there's a couple of little changes, tiny little changes to corruption implicits there. In exchange for this, you're going to gain roughly a 50%, 30 to 50% more multiplier to all sources of increased spell suppression chance that are on the passive tree. And once more, this is going to make it so that right-hand side builds get cap spell suppression, probably actually with a little bit less investment than they do now. Left side builds are going to have a little bit less access to it. Ultimately, I think we're looking like spell suppression is still going to be very, very strong. People on the right-hand side of the tree will hit 100% spell suppression still. People on the left side of the tree, I think, will often probably settle for 50 or 60% that they can get reasonably easily and rely upon some maximum resistances. Ultimately, spell suppression being at less than 100% is something players really undervalue at the moment. Getting, say, 92% spell suppression is an incredibly strong defensive layer. Yes, 8% of spells will get through it and will deal full damage, but the thing people tend to forget is that that often doesn't one-shot you. The days of massive one-shots being everywhere in the game have really sort of decreased over the last little while. We used to see like in the 3.13, 3.14, 3.15 era of the game, we saw a lot of one-shots happening. They've been toned down a fair bit, and that's been since the 3.16 defenses rebalance. Now, Scourge League was a bit of an exception. Scourge League did have a lot of one-shots in it, especially early on. But then after that, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the number of one-shots. The Arch Nemesis modifiers do have a number of one-shots that they provide as well, but those are all really well telegraphed with one exception, which is Aberrath. Aberrath Touch should probably be dealt with at some point. But that said, I think that spell suppression is going to be in a reasonably good place on the right-hand side of the tree to get 100%. Left side, get something like 60% if you can pick it up easily, and then finish off your defenses with other mechanics. That's what I would suggest is the way to build in the future here. Additionally, though, if you're on the left side, you can definitely invest in small cluster jewels. So you can either go with a small cluster jewel, or you can go with a Megalomaniac in Trade League, and these are all getting buffed considerably. Things like Aerialist, Darting Movements, Elegant Form, and the like, these are now getting 10% spell suppression, and these are going to be considerably better than they've been in the past. Arctic Armor is interesting. Arctic Armor is something people have been laughing at for a long time. It's actually really good in a narrow niche, and that niche is Bone Shatter. Bone Shatter is a build that is already fairly strong, and Arctic Armor being buffed is going to make it better. The buffs to Arctic Armor are pretty substantial actually here, and whilst I don't think that this is a defense most players will care about, for people that can use it, again, Bone Shatter, it is really, really good. Flesh and Stone isn't good enough to warrant 25% mana reservation. I agree, but it's getting buffed, but probably not enough. Sandstance version of it is going to have its less damage from attacks from enemies that aren't nearby. This is going to be buffed, but not by enough to make it good. Now we have Defiance Banner. Defiance Banner is in an interesting spot. This is one of the most overwhelmingly widely used gems in the game at the moment. Determination, Defiance Banner, and Grace. This is the cornerstone of a lot of characters' defenses. Determination and Grace are staying as powerful as they were before. Defiance Banner is getting nerfed hard. However, Defiance Banner is so strong that even losing 50% of the increased armor and evasion rating that it's got on it, so it's going from 49% to 24% at gem level 20, this is still not enough, in my opinion, to make it not a very good gem. I think that we will see Defiance Banner very, very widely used in the future, and that this change is not really going to do all that much. Additionally, Defiance Banner's crit reduction is getting stronger. So nearby enemies have their crit chance nerfed against you. This is being improved from 29% to 40%. This doesn't compensate for the changes to armor and evasion rating, but the thing is that those were from such a high level that this is still going to be a good gem even with that, and therefore the increased critical strike amelioration that it provides is going to be all upside. Wind Dancer is getting a bit of an overhaul. This was used all the time back in the era that the game was more one-shotty than it is now. So 3.13 era, this is something that people were using a lot more than they do now, and Wind Dancer is something that's really fallen out of favor. It's going to be changed so that it no longer provides 40% more evasion rating if you've been hit by an attack recently. Instead, it provides 10% more chance to evade attacks if you've been hit by an attack recently. So I have to run the numbers on that, but I think that's quite a substantial buff. The evasion rating formula is quite complex. Arrow Dancing is getting some changes as well. I don't really see this as being all that strong. There's some niche use cases where it would be good, like if you wanted to farm just the Hydra on a character, but why would you make a character just to do the Hydra? I don't think that would make any real sense. Most rounded endgame characters can do that encounter just fine anyway. And otherwise, I don't think it really provides all that much. as an overall package, and I don't think that these changes make it any better. Ward is getting some changes. Now, Ward is getting some new gear support, but the gear support it needs is not present here. The gear support that Ward needs to be a core defensive layer isn't so much the faster recovery, which is important. It is evasion and Ward hybrid gear. That is the thing that you need. That way, Ward is there to take the edge off the big hits that get through, and evasion is there to make sure that most of the hits don't come through. At the moment, the reason people don't use much Ward gear is because using Ward gear means that you can't instead use evasion gear in that spot. And evasion gear, broadly speaking, does the same thing in that it takes away all the damage from some hits, and it does it better than Ward does. So I don't think that these changes are going to be all that meaningful. There are 5 new tiers of a suffix modifier that can roll on Ward-based types. They're going to gain faster restoration of Ward. If you get 3 of these, because you'll only be able to get 3, you can only equip 3 different Ward items, then you're looking at roughly 170% faster restoration of Ward, which means that 1 second of real-world time is 2.7 seconds counted off this 4-second cooldown for your Ward. So that gets it down to 1.5 seconds. That is actually pretty fast, but I'm still just not sure. I'm not convinced that this is going to be a powerful defensive layer overall. The Faith Guard unique helmet is getting buffed as well, but no one's going to care because it's so bad that no one's going to want to use it. Now we have a nerf that's going to affect quite a few endgame players, and that is the Grasping Mail modifier that provides 100% increased global defenses. This is getting gutted. This is getting nerfed to 50%. But again, it's one of those things that's so strong at the moment that it may actually still be all right. Really have to experiment with this, but I don't know whether this is going to be good or not, but I'm certainly not willing to rule it out yet. I don't think it's going to be a chase item like it's been in the past. I don't think people are going to build around this mod on items as much as they have in the past. I do think people are going to use it in conjunction with Ward if they're playing a build that is using Ward, and there are still options for playing Ward-related builds. But I think that this is something that is going to be a lot less popular. The main appeal for picking up Breach Rings in the future is going to be the Tull mod that grants 1% increased attack speed per 25 dexterity. That said, I do think that this is still going to be a fairly strong mod. Now, there are some major changes happening to the Veiled modifiers for Gravicius. In fact, the existing one is being removed, and it's being replaced by something very, very strong. Now, when we were talking earlier about the ways that that players on the right-hand side have access to spell suppression and the left-hand side have access to increased maximum elemental resistances, one of the things that is happening, one of the things that this empowers is maximum resistances make it so much better to convert physical damage that your character suffers into elemental damage. And the Gravicius Veiled modifier is now going to do exactly that. So instead of your character gaining 12 to 14% of your life added as additional maximum energy shield, instead what you're going to get is 8 to 9% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage, and on the same mod, 8 to 9% of physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. This is a stat that GGG have been stingy with a lot of the time in the past, then at times they've made more available. They keep sort of going on a bit of a roller coaster where sometimes they make the ability to convert incoming physical damage to elemental damage easy to acquire, and sometimes they make it harder. But whilst that's the baked on version, there is also the crafted version, which people will probably use more frequently, and that is 5 to 6%. So that's 5 to 6% for physical taken as fire, and also 5 to 6% of physical taken as lightning. This is going to be a pretty powerful defensive layer for a lot of builds, and I think that we will see this used by builds that can get their lightning and fire resistances well above 75%. We'll see that used quite a lot. Basically, a very good mod is being replaced by a new very good mod, but they're going to be used by different characters. One thing that's really important to say is that this is overall a pretty substantial nerf to Ghost Dance and Divine Shield both, because they gained a lot from this. Those builds that use Ghost Dance or Divine Shield can potentially get that from other sources, but they're going to have to try to find a fair amount of life added as extra energy shield, or just a fair amount of energy shield on other gear in order to get maximum value from those powerful keystones. Next, GGG identify correctly that passives that grant blind effect do not adequately reward investment in them, and then they probably don't solve this problem because they only make small changes to the values of blind effect found on the passive tree. I don't think anyone's going to care about this really. I don't think anyone's going to use these. Mind Over Matter is in an interesting spot. Mind Over Matter was super dominant from, I think, 3.12, 13, 14, maybe even maybe 3.15 as well. Mind Over Matter was extremely dominant for a period, and then it got nerfed a couple of times, but the nerfs were always small. Then it got one final nerf that was massive and basically destroyed the Mind Over Matter builds. GGG seem to be taking it slowly and carefully here, buffing it piece by piece, and seeing if they can bring back the playstyle without bringing back the old power. Is they are improving Mind Over Matter as a keystone whilst reducing the power of a lot of the other sources of the same effect that stack with it. So Mind Over Matter as a keystone is going to be 40% of damage taken from mana before life instead of 30%. Interestingly, this is them reverting a past nerf. This was 40% originally at one point, then it was 30%, now it's back to 40%. Damage taken from mana before life can no longer roll as an influence modifier, synthesized implicit, or eldritch implicit modifier on body armor. The Cloak of Defiance unique body armor no longer has 10% of this stat, and the Veiled modifier that grants damage taken from mana before life while focused now provides reduced values of it. So ultimately, their intention here is that this is a first step towards trying to bring back Archmage builds in a good spot, but not in a ridiculous spot like they used to be. This is not enough on its own, and it's not going to solve all the goals there, but it's a first step towards it with a view to perhaps seeing if anyone tries to use Mind Over Matter now, and then reassessing later. Fortification. This is the big melee buff that we've been waiting for, and it's actually pretty substantial. However, it's not necessarily absolutely ideal either. I think that this is one of those awkward spots where they've identified correctly that Fortify is in a bad spot, but they haven't completely solved it. They've added a lot of extra power here, but it's not necessarily where it's most needed. So let's go through the changes. Melee hits that can fortify now generate roughly twice as many fortification stacks as previously, based on damage dealt. Fortification generation against magic and rare monsters has been further increased. This is great, but there's a word that's missing there, and that is unique monsters. Unique monsters often are something that you really need Fortify up against as well, and this is not solving that. So you're going to be running around at 20 to 29% fortification whilst you're running through a map. You won't have it for the first pack. You'll have to hit a monster first, and that's a problem. I really think that maybe you should start, like maybe when you go through a portal, you should come in with 20 or 29 Fortify. I don't know how you would do that. Maybe you can't do that. Maybe that's just me trying to think of a solution to a problem that's not really all that solvable. But this means hopefully that melee builds will have a substantial defensive edge over what they've had in the past. One of the main issues with Fortify is that when it was originally implemented, it was designed to be a defensive layer melee characters get that casters don't get, as a way to balance the fact that melee characters have an intrinsically more dangerous playstyle than casters do. And then over time, casters kept getting it. Casters kept finding ways to get it that were low investment, and it just became this defense that everyone had. Eventually, GGG changed it and nerfed Fortify to a point that it was terrible on casters and bad on melee builds. And now I think what they're trying to do is make it so that it's bad to terrible on casters and fairly good on melee builds. I don't know that they've quite got there, but I think they may or may not have, but they're going to be close. We'll have to see how it plays out, but this may be the melee buff people have been waiting for, or it's not quite going to go far enough. Minion balance. This is a massive section. This is going to completely overhaul all existing minion builds. If you have an existing minion build guide, then it is now no longer going to apply. All of the minions in the game are getting a treatment that's fairly much spell suppression in reverse. So where the spell suppression changes took a lot of the power away from itemization and put it into the passive tree, with minions, it's taking a lot of the power out of the skill gems and putting it into itemization. So basically the reverse. But these changes are interesting. And I think the goal is they want to make minions about the same at medium investment, better at top end investment, and worse at low end investment. But we're going to have to see how that plays out. So let's go through all of the changes. Firstly, damage and life scaling for minions, and as well as the levels of spectres, have all been changed. Broadly speaking, this is a nerf, and there's not necessarily every single gem will be nerfed in this way, but broadly speaking, this is intended as nerfs, and will be made up for in other ways. A new ring is being added to the game, the Bone Ring. This is a new base ring item type, and this is essentially convoking ones except on a ring. Has an implicit minion elemental resistances modifier, can roll minion-related modifiers. The Bone, Ivory, and Fossilized Spirit Shields are no longer going to have a spell damage implicit, they're going to have a minion damage implicit, and they're going to be able to roll minion-related modifiers. So again, this is going to be a new source of offensive power, although you're going to have to then balance between, do I want to get the defensive options of a shield, or do I want to get these minion mods? And ultimately, people will have different ideas as to which way is best to go there. As a result of these implicit changes, Mana Storm is no longer going to be the type of shield it is now. It's going to be a Lacewood Spirit Shield, and Kongming's Stratagem is now going to be an Ancient Spirit Shield. So these are things that have nothing to do with minions. They are going to be migrated off onto different bases. Two new baby versions of the Convoking Wand are being added, the Calling Wand and the Convening Wand. These have level 20 and 50 versions of these are level 20 and 50 versions of the Convoking Wand, and they can roll minion-related modifiers. Some of the minion-related modifiers that are being newly added have been added to the pool for these ones, and some existing mods have been adjusted and or made more common. Now, one thing that I am confused about here is how these are going to be different from Convoking Wands. And now, one of the things that you'll notice is that the only difference between the Hollow Point Dagger and the Pneumatic Dagger, which are two of the high spaces, the highest rare weapon types that allow your elemental damage that's inflicted with this weapon to poison, there's actually very little difference between these three different tiers, because most of the people that are using those weapons are going to scale the elemental damage on them rather than the physical damage, and so they don't really care about a small amount of physical damage on them. And this means that basically there's not much difference between the level 30, 50, and 70 bases. Maybe that's going to be the case with the Calling and Convening Wands. Maybe they are just going to end up being effectively baby Convoking Wands, and the only difference between them is that the Convoking Wand, on the rare time that you attack with it, ends up doing a little bit more damage. Or maybe the Convoking Wand will have mods that the other two can't roll. That's something we're going to have to see. Helmets can no longer roll +1 to 3 to the level of Socketed Minion Gems. Instead, they can roll +1 to 2 to the level of all Minion Skill Gems. This is a buff. This is a big buff, although it is a buff that is actually somewhat running against a lot of the rest of this manifesto. It is something that is going to apply more to lower-end builds and less to high-end builds. High-end builds often keep their main Minion Skill Gem in an Elder-influenced helmet, or a Shaper and Elder-influenced helmet. And so for those builds, they're going to end up getting a lot less out of this. In fact, they're going to end up being a little bit weaker. The vendor recipe for a +1 to the level of Socketed Minion Gems helmet has been replaced with a new recipe that you're going to have to try to find. It is now possible to get +2 to the level of Socketed Minion Gems as a Corrupted Implicit mod on helmets, body armors, gloves, and boots. This is actually going to be a big deal, especially for body armors. There's a real shift here where you're going to want to have your main minion skill in your body armor, rather than it being either your body armor or your helmet, and this is therefore going to create an incentive to corrupt some of those body armors. Ghastly Eye Jewels have had their modifier pool updated. No idea whether this is a nerf, a buff, or a bit of both. Indomitable Army is being nerfed a little bit, and the small passive skills in the Grave Intentions cluster now provide minion life instead of minion elemental resistances. So I think that a lot of the elemental resistances are being moved onto the bone rings now. Problems. Some minion skills are clear outliers in terms of inherent power, so become the default choice for many minion-focused builds. This is basically a whole bunch of numbers changes to address this. If you have a look through here, have a look at skills you've particularly liked, but I think one of the things they're going for here is that they're trying to bring them closer together. So underperforming minion skills like the Herald of Agony are getting buffs mostly, overperforming ones are mostly getting nerfs, but this isn't all that consistent in my mind. Summon Skeletons are definitely getting worse, but things that need buffs like Raised Zombies are not getting them, and things that don't really need buffs in some cases are getting them. One thing that's worth noting, Herald of Purity is getting miles better, and it's already pretty good. And so this is something that I think is really worth keeping your eye on. This may be the new Minion Superstar skill, and it's something that was already fine, but it's just getting all sorts of bonuses. It's 15% more damage, and it's getting an increased AoE bonus on the Crusade Slam, which is their sort of bigger skill, and that's being able to be used more frequently by each of your Sentinels of Purity. This should be a pretty big deal. Additionally, it looks like Arakali's Fang is getting a nerf here. The actual item itself is, but keep in mind that there are going to be some changes to minion poison later, and that's going to have a big factor on Arakaali's Fang. So even though Arakaali's Fang looks like it's getting an absolute gutting here, it's not. That is one of the rarest unique items in the game though, so don't plan it as a league starter because it's very hard to get your hands on early on. It could be 10 exalts in week 1 if it turns out to be good. So going through all the changes, Summon Raging Spirit is getting a big buff, Summon Holy Relic is also getting a big buff, and Summon Reaper is getting a modest buff, and all of these are skills that I think are worth a look into, whereas the poor Summon Skeletons are getting made quite a bit worse. Okay, now we have the biggest change of all to minions, and that is buff Spectres. One of the things that's happening here is that minions now gain the same bonuses from Endurance, Frenzy, and Power Charges as players do, rather than the significantly elevated bonuses that other monsters gain. So this is a much bigger deal than it looks like. Currently, players gain 40% crit chance per power charge, and monsters gain 150% per power charge. So this is a huge nerf to critical strike chance that monsters can gain pretty much for free from having Spectres along. However, this does mean that you are no longer locked into using specific Spectres, and there will be other sources of this power. There's a number of things that will be added later in the Manifesto that will provide alternate ways to get minion crit chance. I think that what GGG are going for here is that the days of 100% minion crit chance are over, but that there will be ways to get sort of 50% minion crit chance with a huge amount of critical strike multiplier there for the same overall damage. At least that seems to be where they're going for. We're going to have to see whether they achieve that goal or not. Minions no longer have hidden penalties to bleeding, ignite, and poison damage. Summon Reaper no longer has a hidden bonus to bleeding damage that counteracts this penalty. As a result, minions now deal approximately twice as much poison damage. Oh, remember what we were saying about Arakaali's Fang. They deal 3.5 times as much ignite damage and 7 times as much bleed damage. So this is potentially a pretty big deal here as well. This means that we're at the moment, in the 3.18 environment, the correct way to scale minion damage tends to be through the use of Host Chieftain Spectres, allowing them to crit. Now you will have a bunch of new options. You can still try and do crit scaling, and there will still be support for that, or you can try and make your minions inflict bleeds, ignites, and poisons if you want to do that instead. And all of those should at least be compelling to try. Some of them will work, some of them won't, and potentially 1 or 2 of them may be really overpowered. That's going to have to be a lot of theory crafting to work that out. Investing in minion critical strikes has been possible in a very niche manner for some time now, but it's never been a fully supported build option. Additionally, the removal of a large amount of potential critical strike chance from power charges in the above change would render critical minion builds near impossible without further changes. Solution: add new sources of minion critical strike investment. These are not intended to fully compensate for the lost critical strike chance from power charges, but instead to more than make up for the lost damage via the addition of multiple sources of minion critical strike multiplier. So Spirit Offering is being completely overhauled. It's no longer going to do what it does now at all. Instead, it's going to grant 148% increased minion critical strike chance at gem level 20 and 39% increased minion critical multiplier at gem level 20. Fearsome Force is no longer going to grant minion AoE. It's instead going to grant minion critical strike chance and multiplier. The minion critical strike chance offense mastery is being replaced by a minion AoE mastery, and the minion modifiers mentioned above have a family of minion critical strike chance modifiers available on wands and shields, and critical strike multiplier modifiers on wands. So this is really one of those things where there's a bunch of changes that we really need hard numbers on. Overall, I don't know whether this is going to make things stronger or weaker, but we're going to have to find that out when we get the full details. Lastly, we have a really big nerf to the Necromancer Ascendancy. The idea here that GGG are going for, and I think this is a fairly sensible call, is they're looking at minion builds at the moment and saying that basically players are 95% Necromancers, 5% Guardian, pretty much. There's pretty much nothing else that's being run. And the reason that people are running Necromancers is because of Unnatural Strength, so they are gutting Unnatural Strength completely. And some of that power is being returned through the helmet changes that we discussed earlier. So, and then additionally, potentially more of it through the corruption implicits on chess pieces. So this is something that I think is going to ultimately be about build diversity for minion builds at the expense, obviously, of making the Necromancer weaker. Will the Necromancer be terrible? No, it will still be fine, I think. Something that's of note here is that minions will now gain Unholy Might through the Necromancer's Unnatural Strength. This is a lot weaker, and I think a lot of people will skip it, but there will be some people that want this. Next, there's a whole section on miscellaneous skill and support gem balance. There are some changes to corpse explosions, but fundamentally this is fixing up a mistake that was made in a past balance patch. In the past, all player-created corpses, now when I'm saying player-created, I mean created by a player skill. This is not monsters you've slain. This is when you have generated a corpse. You've spawned one through the use of Unearth, Desecrate, or a similar skill. All of them were intended to be capped in life at the life that a Kitava's Herald would have in that zone. However, GGG stuffed up and missed two, Auric Champion and Auric Colossus. These had 60% more life than intended. This resulted in Detonate Dead doing 60% more damage when those corpses were detonated than intended, and Detonate Dead Ignite builds, as a result, were gaining 60% more damage overall as a result of this. So that is being fixed. Next, skills that cause corpse explosions derive much of their damage scaling from increased maximum corpse life, mostly from passive tree skills. This pressures builds utilizing these skills to only be necromancers, as it provides a large amount of corpse life, and it means that corpses of enemies you kill are not as useful for damage compared to corpses you spawn yourself. Additionally, since the percentage of corpse life dealt as damage by these skills does not scale with gem levels, there's not sufficient incentive to level them up, especially for builds that are scaling ignite damage. Solution: remove the increased maximum corpse life stat from the Necromancer Ascendancy completely, and reduce the values available elsewhere, increase the percentage of corpse life dealt as damage for all corpse explosion skills to partially offset this substantial damage loss, and have this percentage scale up with the level of the skill. So without going into the details of everything here, Detonate Dead is an indicative version of this. It is going from 6% of the corpse's maximum life as fire damage is going up to 7.9% at gem level 20, presumably 8% at gem level 21, whereas previously it was just a flat 6%. Note that Vaal Detonate Dead is getting nerfed here as well. Vaal Detonate Dead's damage, it previously was doing 50% more damage than normal Detonate Dead. It is now just going to do the same damage as normal Detonate Dead. So it's losing that 50% more multiplier, and even at high gem levels, it's not going to be able to build back up to that. That applies to a bunch of other skills as well: Cremation, Volatile Dead, and Body Swap. Next up is Fire Trap. Fire Trap is getting a nerf, but this is not a gutting. So Inquisitor Righteous Fire was the best build of 3.18 overall in terms of just performance, sending characters to level 100 and so on and so forth. This build is getting a fair amount of nerfs here, but I don't think these are gutting. It's losing about 26% of the damage that it's got from its supplementary damage skill, Fire Trap, but it's still going to deal all the damage it deals with Righteous Fire. It's still going to have all of its powerful life regeneration, but the big thing it's losing is access to spell suppression on top of everything else. The Inquisitor is not going to be able to cap spell suppression without extreme investment in the future, and I think most players aren't going to try to cap it. They're likely going to run a Fire Trap / RF Inquisitor with maybe 60% spell suppression that they can get reasonably easily, in addition to having very high maximum resistances and a lot of overall just buffer, life and energy shield. So these characters will ignore evasion as a defensive layer. They will scale spell suppression somewhat, but not necessarily cap it, and they will focus on life, armor, and maximum resistances. Next, we have some discussion of cooldown-based traps. So Seismic Trap is the other skill that comes to mind for a lot of people as a massive overperformer. Now, one of the things that is being done here is that the ability to spam these traps is being reined in a bit. I don't know that this is enough of a nerf to Seismic Trap, and I also don't like what it's going to do to Flamethrower Trap and Lightning Spire Trap. But let's go through the changes anyway. Advanced Trap Support is no longer going to have the increased skill effect duration. Hasty Reconstruction is going to be renamed to Overprepared and is no longer going to grant 30% increased cooldown recovery rate. Flamethrower Trap is getting 15% more damage to partially compensate. Lightning Spire Trap is getting 15% more damage to partially compensate. I think that we could probably see Seismic Trap get a 15% damage nerf, Flamethrower Trap and Lightning Spire Trap get another 10% damage buff, and I think that then at that point this package of changes would be in a better place overall. I don't think that the loss of Advanced Trap Support's skill effect duration is going to feel good on Lightning Spire Trap or Flamethrower Trap at all. Those traps did need the skill effect duration a lot, and so yeah, I don't like this package of changes. I think really Seismic Trap was the problem there, and the other ones were in a reasonable place. Lightning Spy Trap was just a little bit less powerful than it needs to be, and I assume Flamethrower Trap's about the same. And so, yeah, I don't like this package of changes here. Explosive Arrow is next. GGG wanted to nerf the damage that's done by Ignite versions of Explosive Arrow, especially the Ballista versions, but they didn't want to have collateral damage of also nerfing hit-based Explosive Arrow, which they feel underperforms. So what they're doing is they're changing it in such a way that Explosive Arrow is doing 10% more damage as a hit skill, 20% less damage as an Ignite skill. I think that the Ignite version will be fine, but will be meaningfully worse than in 3.18. It should still be very, very playable with this nerf. Next, there are some changes being made to cast when damage taken and cast on death. These were changed as a result of 3.17 changes. So in 3.17, GGG made a number of changes to try to make self-casting more appealing. They didn't get there, but what they did was they made pretty much all spells do 30 to 40% more damage, and then they provided a roughly equivalent nerf to most of the main ways players trigger spells. So this was things like cast on critical strike, cast while channeling. Those got nerfed, whereas the base damage of the spells got buffed. And the intention was that triggered spells came out basically equal, but they missed two triggers. They missed cast on death, and they missed the cast when damage taken support, because they thought, oh yeah, no one's really using these. Well, cast on death became one of the most broken builds of 3.18. It's not that cast on death was universally good, it's just that it was absolutely busted in invitations, and people would build a character that was just popping off a cast on death and would one-shot an entire invitation with it. And this meant that you could have the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds Uber versions getting killed literally 75 times an hour by one player. And this could even be multi-boxed at the really top end. This meant that access to those invitations became much more expensive, the loot they dropped became much less valuable, and every time that there was some profit to be made from doing this, you would see more of a shift to players going and farming these invitations, and in doing so, just collapsing the value of running them again. For this reason, Cast on Death is getting nerfed. It's actually not getting nerfed as much as I expected. I almost expected the gem to go Legacy. It's going from 304% more damage to 152% more, which is a big nerf, but it's not the gutting I was expecting, and I do think there will still be a lot of one-shotting going on at endgame, just not necessarily with every mod. Additionally, the anomalous Cast on Death support is getting gutted. Like, this is an absolute smashing. It's going from... it's literally losing 90% of its power, the alternate quality on that. Cast when damage taken is getting a damage nerf as well. This is mostly targeting the Wardloop builds. It's pretty substantial, but I don't think it's a killer. Wardloop will still be fine. Wardloop was a really, really strong build, and it looks like it's still going to be completely fine, even with recombinators going away and therefore making ward gear harder to roll. Next, there's a couple of changes to the blessing supports. So if you've been using Divine Blessing or Eternal Blessing, then you'll probably want to check these out. But basically, blessing skills can no longer be supported by Life Tap, and then they've got slight numbers changes. Sniper's Mark is losing its Flask regeneration. Sniper's Mark was really good without that, and so I don't think it's going to particularly matter all that much. Sniper's Mark is still a really powerful skill that people will still use on projectile builds, regardless of this, and ultimately, the additional flask charge, the life flask charges was a little bit of a bonus, but was not something that was particularly overwhelming. You can always get the same, get a similar effect from the Roslatha Pantheon if you need it. Hydrosphere is getting nerfed again. It seems to be getting nerfed all the time, and it just keeps being good all the time. Hydrosphere is very, very niche, but very powerful in that niche. Next, there's a whole bunch of gems that are getting buffs here. Now, this one's been interesting because a lot of people have been poo-pooing this as no changes at all. This is definitely not true. There are a few of these are going to be big changes. Most of them are not, but a few of them are pretty substantial. So things like Artillery Ballista are probably not getting enough to be used, and that'll be the same for a fair number of these. Crackling Lance, Devouring Totem, I think these are still going to be bad. But let's talk about the ones that I think are more significant. Cleave is getting increased radius. Now, people have been saying that this is a meme still, but increased radius is such a powerful stat on these sorts of skills that this is a big deal. Even just going from +8 to +10, this is going to make Cleave feel better to play for people that want to play it. I think most people still won't want to play it, But if you do want to try it, it is going to be in a much better place for this buff. This is not a small buff like people are saying. Decoy Totem is getting a huge boost of extra life, and Decoy Totem is already pretty good. So Decoy Totem is something that gets used a lot in hardcore, but that is actually very, very useful even in softcore, and I highly recommend playing around with it. What Decoy Totem lets you do is push beyond your character's strengths. If your character is currently just strong enough to beat, say, the Shaper, and you don't think you can beat Cyrus with it, you don't think you're strong enough, Decoy Totem may be the thing that takes you over the edge to beating an additional boss that you couldn't beat before. The way you want to use it is be very aware of where it is, and remember that the boss will mostly target it, but there are some skills that they'll have that will ignore the Decoy Totem and will target you, and also be aware that some monsters can't be taunted. But Decoy Totem is very strong. Divergent Decoy Totem is even better, and there is a funny alternate quality that I want to mess around with that's getting a huge buff here. That's the one that has a chance to explode when it dies, dealing a whole bunch of damage to nearby enemies. That damage is going to get scaled because it's based on the life of the totem. Okay, so Firestorm is getting buffed. I don't think this is good enough, but it's maybe worth trying. Haste, though, is huge. Haste is an aura that pretty much no one has been using. If you're using an offensive aura, then you're using different ones at the moment, but Haste is getting an enormous buff. It seems like the numbers on this are pretty small. 15% increased movement speed, 24% increased cast and attack speed. The thing is that builds get a lot of increased aura effect at the moment. And as a result, you're not really getting 15 and 24 here. You might be getting 21 and 33. And then at that point, that starts being really substantial. If you've ever tried running with 15% movement speed boots, then going up to 35%, you'll know how much of an increase in power getting that change is. It's really substantial, and that's haste for you. Also, it's worth saying that it is actually a substantial defense to have more movement speed on your character as well. Vaal Haste is getting an improvement to movement speed, but is not getting any comparative improvement to attack and cast speed because it doesn't really need one. What do I think this is going to mean for leveling characters? If you're playing in softcore, Haste is now your first aura. I think that's pretty much going to be universal. I think you're going to not see characters leveling with Determination anymore. Determination is really good defensively, but you can just put it on at endgame once you're able to run multiple auras. Until that point, I think you're just going to want to use Haste. Haste is going to add movement speed, which is a big deal, and attack and cast speed is a big deal. It's exactly what you want while you're leveling, when dying doesn't matter. Once you get probably to like level 83, 84, where dying starts to sting a bit more, at that point, you may want to consider either removing haste for a defensive aura or supplementing it with a defensive aura. I also think this is going to dramatically decrease the amount of players that use Purity of Elements in the Axe as well. Purity of Elements is really good in the Axe as a solution just when you can't get the resists on gear, but haste is just going to be this really compelling alternative that people are going to want to use. One problem with haste, though, it has a very high dexterity requirement. You don't have to factor that in, and maybe you will hit a point where you can't level it anymore. That's going to be just something interesting. It'll be something different and fresh. Reeve's getting buffed from bad to bad. Scorching Ray is getting a buff here. Now, Scorching Ray is something that I've not really seen anyone try this, but I do think that the unique Scepter Balefire has some potential in conjunction with Scorching Ray and the Squire as maybe a high-end investment build. And that's something that you'd need to be extremely good at sort of manually dodging monster skills using Frostblink, because Frostblink is something you can use while you're channeling another skill. But it's something that could be really strong as a way to do a lot of damage single target, or alternately as a way to use Scorching Ray totems really effectively. So that's something that I've got in mind as a maybe for 3.19. Definitely not as a league starter, but as something to play around with. Shock Nova is now gaining really a change of identity. Shock Nova is getting a maximum effective shock bonus and rings always shock. This is a pretty substantial improvement. If you can make this work well, this can be used to augment your primary damage skill. So you'll have Shock Nova doing modest damage, maybe you'll use it as a 4-link, and you're using this as a way to soften the target up for your primary 6-link skill. In this sense, this will be like using Bear Trap on a trap build. Bear Trap provides a damage dealt increase to your other traps. Soulrend, though, is the big one. Soulrend is getting a big buff here. It's going from 2138 base damage at gem level 20 per second to 2642. this is a substantial numerical increase to a gem that is already capable of beating the Feared. And so I think that this might be something that players play around with a lot more. Soulrend's one of those things that has tremendous damage projection because it pierces everything and it deals damage over time. It's something that just feels like a really good skill when it works, but it's also something that hasn't been good for a long time. I'm keen to see how it feels with these changes, and it is something that is on my potential league starter list for this league. Spellslinger is getting changes that don't buff the builds that already use it, but that might make new builds possible with it. So the damage that's provided by your equipped wand is getting tremendously increased. If you've got a good wand and one that has a huge amount of flat fire damage, for instance, to attacks on it, and then that's something that will then add a huge amount of fire damage to your spells that are used through Spellslinger. And this is something I want to really play around with a bit, and I think you'll see a number of people try new builds with this. I just cannot yet judge whether they're going to be good or not. Sunder is getting a huge buff. This is a multiple purpose buff. It's getting more damage. It's going from 275% base damage to 325%. That's substantial. That's almost a 20% more multiplier to damage. And its damaging wave is going to travel 60% faster. This damage projection buff is actually more significant than the flat damage buff. Sunder is probably back on the menu. This has been a skill that was absolutely god tier for a period for melee leveling, then got nerfed, and now I think it's back. Vile Flame Blast is getting a big buff. It's a very hard skill to use, but I think people might try it again. It's going to do a lot of extra spell damage for each stage. Note that this is spell damage, this isn't ignite damage, and I don't recall whether Vile Flame Blast actually has the ability for spell damage to improve its ailment damage as well. I'd have to have a look into that, but for the moment, seems like it's going to be an improvement to it as a hit skill. I don't know how this is going to play out, but the numbers on it can't be ignored. So it's something to potentially play around with as as something. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a good build, but it might be a good meme build. Arrow Nova is getting buffed. This is something that no one ever uses, and it was something that came up in discussion recently because we're trying to track down various things related to Maven invitations and which Awakened support gems they drop, and it turned out that Awakened Arrow Nova seems to be one of the rarest of the gems that are available from the Maven's Crucible. So maybe it's something that GGG expected to be good, but that no one seems to really want to use. Maybe these damage increases will improve it. I don't know. Don't really see this getting used much by players at the moment. And Critical Strike Affliction support is getting numerical buffs that I don't think are enough, but that I'm very open to being proven wrong on. Next, we have the Ascendancy balance section. Here, the Trickster Ascendancy is getting a complete overhaul. This is not yet being revealed, and that information is going to come later. Next, the Juggernaut is getting some changes. It is really funny because if you look at this on the Path of Exile subreddit, a lot of people are saying, why are GGG nerfing Juggernaut? They are definitely not nerfing Juggernaut. This is actually a really substantial change, and it's something that is going to provide a lot of extra power there. So the Juggernaut is picking up some really, really, really impactful defenses against elemental damage here. And we'll get to that in a sec. This is what they're losing. Current Unbreakable. Armor received from body armor is doubled, 5% reduced damage taken, regen 2% of life per second, 1.5% of physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds is regenerated as life per second. So this is now being changed. It's being split into two nodes. The first node is going to remain the name Unbreakable. This is going to have two mods on it. It's still going to keep the thing that causes the armor from your chest piece to be doubled, but then it's going to gain 8% of armor applies to elemental damage from hits. Now, 8% does not sound like much. However, the thing with this is that this is applied after your elemental resistances are applied. So if you take a hit for 10,000 raw fire damage, let's say you got 83% fire resistance, that gets nuked down to 1,700. That's now a small fire damage hit. That's the sort of thing that armor shines against, is hits in that sort of 1,700 damage range. So that will then get reduced substantially further by this additional bonus of armor that you've got. I think Unbreakable will be very widely taken by builds that are running Determination and will still run the post-nerf Defiance Banner, because even though Defiance Banner is getting nerfed, it will still be one of the best reservation skills in the game for how little it reserves. And this will provide you with a tremendous bonus to the defenses that will counteract the fact that you probably can't get spell suppression on your build. Next, there's going to be a new notable added, which is Untiring. This is going to keep the 1.5% of physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds regenerated as life that used to be part of Unbreakable, but it's also going to gain 40% increased life regeneration rate. That is then going to make the 1.5% better than it otherwise was. This is going to be a pretty substantial buff, actually, overall to Juggernaut. Not every Juggernaut will want both of these nodes, and there will be some builds that would prefer Old Unbreakable. But I think that generally, a lot of builds did not have 8 compelling points to spend in Juggernaut. They had 6. Those builds now gain more power because they're just going to take these extra nodes and they're going to gain more from it. But they're also going to have more options as well. And I think Juggernaut will be played quite a bit more as a result of this. It won't be league started as much because people will underestimate these changes. But once people play with them a bit and a couple of content creators start coming out with some information on that, then you'll start seeing it. Chieftain's Tower Forest Strength is not providing enough damage at the moment, so it's getting doubled. This is probably still not all that great, really. Pathfinder's Master Alchemist skill is weak, which causes Pathfinder to mostly be played on Chaos-based builds because non-Chaos builds have a bad node that is aimed at them. So Master Alchemist is getting changed substantially, and Nature's Boon is getting nerfed. Master Alchemist is losing its 20% chance to freeze, ignite, and shock during any flask effect, and instead it's going to gain magic utility flasks applied to you to have 20% increased effect. Note the wording on that is designed in a way that it works with Mage Blood, and so I think you will see this being something that people who can get themselves a Mage Blood will start the league as a Pathfinder. They will pick this node from the beginning, they'll never unspec it, and then when they get the Mage Blood, it'll be a huge, huge, huge boost to their power as well. Pathfinder's Nature's Boon Ascendancy notable, no longer grants 6% reduced elemental damage taken. That's somewhat ouch, but Pathfinder is in a spot where it can get spell suppression anyway, and so as a result, I think you'll end up that will work out in the wash. Unique item balance. This one's interesting in that Crystallized Omniscience and Ashes of the Stars are both called out here as powerful unique amulets that have been adopted by a wide variety of builds since their introduction in Siege of the Atlas. And so I think a lot of people will read that and think, oh, they're both getting nerfed. But then only Omni gets nerfed, because only Omni needs a nerf. Ashes of the Stars is a fundamentally fair item. It's basically a rare, it's at the upper end of rare item power. Crystallized Omniscience, on the other hand, has been completely busted, and it has rendered a bunch of other amulets that were previously chase items to dumpster tier. So things like Leadership's Price, Ulnatol's Vow, things like All's Uprising, these have seen tremendous reductions in their usage rate since Crystallized Omniscience came out, because for most builds, the best thing you can do is to reorient your build so that Crystallized Omniscience fits in. Well, Crystallized Omniscience is losing 1/3 of its power. This is still going to leave it the best amulet in the game for a lot of builds, but it's no longer going to be so far above everything else that it's crazy. It's instead just going to be a really good item. I do think that it will still be one of the most used items at endgame though, at least late in the league once there's a lot of them in circulation. Melding of the Flesh is next, and Melding of the Flesh is being nerfed. It is going to require more investment to get it to work. So it's going to have a drawback of -4 to -6 to all maximum elemental resistances, and this will not change existing versions if you play in Standard. This is going to be a pretty substantial drawback to this item, and it's something that's going to just simply cause it to take more investment to get working, but it's still going to be really, really strong, and it's still going to be really widely used. Next, there is a substantial nerf to Brittle as an ailment. This is interesting in that this is posed as a nerf to players, but this is actually going to make players a lot safer because players suffer Brittle as well, and Brittle, getting inflicted by Brittle in the Simulacrum in particular, but in Delirious maps in general, is something that kills you a lot. So the way that Brittle works is that it is being nerfed from 15% base critical strike chance at the top roll, so that's equivalent to a 50% shock. That is now being nerfed to 6%. So instead of Brittle having 30% the magnitude of a shock, it will have 12% the magnitude of a shock. Minimum value will be 2%, which has previously been 5%. The biggest change here is that this is going to severely, severely nerf those Eldritch Implicit Boots with Brittle ground on them. Those are still going to be strong, I think, but they're no longer going to be anywhere near as good as they are now. But yeah, like I was saying, this is going to have a big impact on the Simulacrum, and it is going to make players safer in the Simulacrum, because a lot of the times that you die there, it's because you have been brittle. Now we have the big nerf that I think is going to affect the most players, reservation efficiency nerfs. This is only one thing that's going away, but it's a big one because almost everyone takes this specific mastery. The Reservation Mastery that granted 15% increased mana reservation efficiency of skills has been removed from the passive skill tree entirely. The life version of this is being nerfed from 30% to 20%, which is much more niche. And the Reservation Mastery that causes your auras to have increased effect on you now has a value of 10% rather than 15%. So let's talk about what this is going to mean in practice. This one is still mandatory. 10% aura effect is still better than anything else you're going to get, and every build is going to want to take a reservation cluster, and every build is going to want to take this mastery. Then you're still going to want to get some reservation efficiency. You're not going to get this easy 15% anymore, but there'll still be a lot of sources of it available on gear. And this is going to mostly mean that your character is going to be a bit weaker up to about the point that you hit maybe level 87 or so. And at that point, you'll start getting access to all of those other sources of reservation efficiency. At that point, you'll start being able to use Eldritch Implicits to get a bit of it. You'll be able to use, potentially on your helmet, use Essences of Loathing, either Deafening or just Shrieking before that. And you'll be able to get yourself a fair amount of mana reservation efficiency that way and make up for most of this change, then still be able to reserve the auras you can now. There'll also be a number of other sources of reservation efficiency that you'll be able to, spec into if you're willing to spend a bit more. Ultimately, this is definitely going to be a reduction in character power, and it's probably the single biggest general nerf in this manifesto, but I don't think it's a sky is falling moment because there's always new sources of power that come out every league. The flask modifiers that grant flask charges when you hit by an enemy are getting nerfed hard. Really, really, really getting nerfed hard. These have been giving 100% flask uptime, and they are getting nerfed. There's a couple of changes to niche things here. There's the veiled modifiers that cause skills to cost no mana or life or focused. Those are being removed entirely. And what GG is saying here is more that they constrain design space. So presumably there's things that they want to do that they can't do because this ability to cast skills for free is available. So they are nuking them with no real need for it at the moment, but potentially the future design space is what they're looking at there. That probably means there may be a gem being added in 3.19. That's going to be the reasoning there. Now, there's going to be a couple of other little changes to Chainbreaker. Chainbreaker is getting buffed a little bit, and this is one of those things that has been problematic ever since it was introduced. For a period, it was so good that everyone had to use it. Then it got nerfed and got to the point that it was so bad that no one could use it, and they're trying to find a happy medium. I don't know if they've found it or not. We're going to find that out. Finally, we have some additional sources of recoup being added as jewel mods. So Crimson, Viridian, and Cobalt jewels can now roll 4 to 6% of damage taken recouped as life as a suffix mod. I'm just going to quickly check with a refresh if there's anything that's been changed, because sometimes GGG do add additional changes, and we'll see if there's been anything done there. No, nothing's been changed there. So keep in mind that this is nerf day. The buffs will come later, but this is what we've got at the moment. Once more, as a bit of a summary, spell suppression is going to be harder to get on Inquisitors and is still going to be fine for Shadows and for Rangers. And overall, I think it's going to be a little bit of a change, but not the sweeping, not the gutting that people think. We will see more people going for uncapped spell suppression than we have seen in the past as a result of this, and that will still be meaningful. That is better than a lot of people like to say it is. We will see a massive shakeup in minions. All pre-3.19 builds for build guides for minions are dead, and there'll be new builds that will rise in their place, new build guides that will rise in their place, and I really do feel sorry for Guzzy TV. He is going to be very, very busy trying to work all this out, especially when some of the mods aren't known yet. Then there's the changes to reservations. Defiance Banners being halved in power, and it will still be good, and the reservation changes in general are somewhat of a nerf, but not the sort of sweeping, gutting changes that people were expecting. They do have more of an effect on Determination and Grace than on other auras, and that's because those double dip on aura effect, and it's going to be a bit harder to justify as much investment into Aura Effect in the future because Aura Effect is going to provide less benefit when you can run less auras. That's all I got on this. May your Varlobs have interesting results.